This is Tina. Tina lives in Scotland where life is not perfect, but is much the way we imagine a lot of families in modern Scotland. Tina is getting by the best she can in a mediocre and loveless marriage to Geoff. She often wonders if this is how it's going to be forever. Tina was planning to leave Geoff. She could imagine the acres of arguments ahead of her, but she really didn't want to make Old Bones the man who in the middle of very mundane sex would suddenly stop and say, "Damn, I forgot to email in my expenses." Tina and Geoff had assigned themselves to traditional roles as soon as the confetti-like petals had been brushed from their hair. Geoff went out and sold computers. Tina did everything else, for her husband and their two children, Beth and Zoe. Tina did not believe in God, didn't believe in much really, apart from being kind to small children and old dogs. Geoff, though, believed in a robust, manly Church of Scotland God. God is the law, Geoff said pompously, and the law is God. One day, Geoff came into the living room with a large glass of Talisker in his hand, and toasting the thin air said, "Well, today's the day when life in Britain changed forever." As time goes on, Scotland begins to adopt stricter and stricter laws for women. The first law is passed. All girls who had entered puberty had to wear the scarf. Tina watched the demonstrations on TV news. There was no way that men would be able to impose the new law. The whole thing was absurd. "Give up work? What are you talking about?" "Says who?" she said. "Says the law. Get used to it, Tina," Geoff replied. The latest thing was a kind of robe, black, naturally, that they had to swaddle themselves in from top to toe. Eyes, feet, hands were all that were left. They were being erased, blacked out inside their blankets. Geoff had already pulled Zoe from school. Geoff had sold Tina's little car because "you don't need it anymore after all," he said. Apparently the law said that Tina was only allowed to drive the car if she was accompanied by a male relative. "This is ridiculous," she said, and Geoff punched her in the face. Geoff and the other men were becoming emboldened, physically, verbally, and sexually abusing the women in society, including Tina. Casualties began to mount. A woman was flogged in the Tron for being seen in public with a man. Now they had to wear a garment that resembled a circus tent, with just a little grill to look through. They had disappeared completely now. They were invisible women. Women disappeared every day. They were kidnapped and beaten and imprisoned and raped and whipped and murdered for talking to a man in public. "This is ridiculous," Tina said, and Geoff punched her twice in the face. Tina wondered if this is how it was going to be forever, and if there was anything she could do about it. One day, Tina finds that Geoff had given away their underage daughter to a much older man. He tells her she's not a baby anymore. Zoe's 12, old enough to be married, according to the law. Reaching her breaking point, Tina tells her remaining daughter goodbye, decides to strip naked and walk outside in defiance, wondering how far she will get. Our visceral reaction to this story begs the question, do we feel this treatment is wrong merely because we are in present-day Scotland, or because this treatment violates Tina and the other women's universal human rights?
First, we must examine the fundamental question, what are universal human rights? In 1948, after the atrocities of World War II, the United Nations came together to issue the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or the UDHR. The document was the result of a collaboration of many different countries to define a list of fundamental universal human rights that we must protect and perhaps even promote. Essentially, believing in universal human rights means that you believe that all people, regardless of any denominator, have the same fundamental rights that must be protected. At first glance, this sounds pretty good, but over the years, this notion has been subjected to heavy criticism. Thus, we must ask, what are the problems with universal human rights? The main criticism is that universal human rights are a Western conception that is being pushed on other cultures without their approval or consent. These critics advocate for a cultural relativist approach instead. Cultural relativism is the belief that one should judge the beliefs, values, and practices of a culture from within the culture itself. For instance, when judging the practice of polygamy, a cultural relativist would not make a universal judgment that being married to multiple women is wrong, but instead judge the practice within each cultural and historical context. Therefore, we would not make sweeping judgments about rights across different cultures, but instead allow for our understanding of different cultures to influence our ideas about right and wrong. So, if there are all these problems with human rights talk, why should we not all be cultural relativists? There are many counter-arguments which should make us seriously question the cultural relativist position. Many of the critics of universal human rights argue that it is wrong because these are Western ideals and it's imperialistic to force these upon non-Western societies. This argument is flawed because the truth of the claim should not be judged based on its origin, but on the claim itself. This is called genetic fallacy. Just because universal human rights, or human dignity for that matter, are Western concepts, which I'm not sure they are, does not mean that they are any less true. Second, differences within cultures are also underestimated. Often there is a large dose of dissent against practices we may view as violating human rights. For instance, it is not true that an entire society accepts practices such as female genital mutilation. There are powerful movements that already exist within these societies.
In autumn, a tiny market town in central Pokot, a group of men and women are gathering to discuss how to replace cutting with an alternative rite of passage, which gives girls a chance to become women without being cut. This group is a grassroots self-help group called Kepsteno Rotwo, meaning abandon the knife.
The tendency to accept societies as homogenous and in agreement with such practices does resistance movements a disservice and tends to paint the West as the only savior. In reality, culture is not a monolith. It is absolutely possible to find the people within a culture who disagree and empower them. Treating cultures as having homogenous views often privileges the views of the majority at the expense of the minority.
Lastly, differences across cultures are exaggerated. We can often find an overarching principle to agree upon. In the video, we heard about the need for a rite of passage into womanhood. Looking strictly at this principle, which underlies FGM, are we not so different? Aren't bar mitzvahs, quinceañeras, and debutante balls centered around the same concept? At our core, we often find that people and their principles aren't actually that different after all. Without fully accepting the cultural relativist framework, we can still accept many of their critiques of universal human rights. For example, Mutua critiques universal human rights talk as being fundamentally Eurocentric, and thus leaving out a lot of other cultures and perspectives from the conversation. It pushes Western perceptions, beliefs, and values on other cultures without acknowledging the problems and human rights issues that also exist in Western countries. It is clear from Mutua's writing that there is a need for more inclusivity in the universal human rights movement. Looking at Tina in our gut, we may believe that there is something special about her, something special about all humans that deserve respect. Many philosophers describe this to be an inherent human dignity. Dignity is one of those words that seems to say a lot, but is very difficult to define. The Merriam-Webster dictionary defines dignity as the quality or state of being worthy, honored, or esteemed. Human dignity has many qualities, which critics say make it ambiguous. Human dignity is inherent and not earned. It is inalienable and that we aren't given it. It is recognizable and deserves respect. Across human beings, dignity is equal, and yes, dignity is abstract. Now, where does this dignity come from? Is it because we have rational agency? Is it because we all share a set of capabilities? Or is it because if we all sat down at a table and talked about it, that's what would make the most sense? So what is rational agency and why is it pertinent to this discussion of dignity? Rational agency, simply put, is the ability or capacity to set one's own ends or goals and plans. This rational agency is also referred to as autonomy. As Immanuel Kant says, autonomy is the ground of human nature and therefore of every rational nature. Individuals who believe that rationality and autonomy is essential to human dignity face the obstacle that not all humans possess rationality, like some infants, Alzheimer's patients, and individuals with disabilities. In effect, this argument ensures some people may be left out. Your gut may tell you that the treatment of Tina is wrong, not just because she's a rational being who can set her own ends, but also simply because she's a human deserving of respect. If this is the case, then the grounding of human rights and rationality is unacceptable. So now we seem to be right back where we started. We have rejected cultural relativism. We believe there are universal human rights that should encompass all people, but aren't quite sure how to ground them. We propose that we should look to Martha Nussbaum's ideas about capacities and collaboration to ground universal human rights. Martha Nussbaum asserts that the basic idea is that human beings have a worth that is indeed inalienable because of their capacities for various forms of activity and striving. If you remember, Kant also took a capacity-based approach to grounding dignity in human rights, but he only recognized the capacity for autonomy/rationality. Thinking back to Tina, Tina has a right to autonomy, but she also has a right to beneficence, which we can loosely define as the flourishing of a person. Nussbaum, unlike Kant, includes capabilities beyond rationality in her grounding of dignity. This is important because it broadens the people who can be considered to have human dignity. As Nussbaum says, refusing to ground dignity in rationality alone and insisting on grounding it in a varied set of capacities that are all elements in the life of a type of animal being, we can easily move forward to recognize that the world contains many different varieties of dignity, some human and some belonging to other species. Nussbaum argues for 10 capacities that she's determined through conversations with others to be necessary to live a dignified life. Most importantly, these capacities are not set in stone. They can evolve through conversations. Under Nussbaum's framework, conversations across cultures are encouraged and even required to figure out the minimal level of capabilities that an individual needs to live a dignified life in their society. This addresses many of the cultural relativist concerns by not considering culture and leaving others out of the conversation. The approach may not be perfect, as critics of a capacities-based approach may still say that you are grounding rights based on capacities and not based on an innate human quality. However, Nussbaum's framework is flexible in that it allows for a constant discourse to address those that may be inadvertently left out of the framework.
Now, clearly not everyone is in agreement with this frame of mind. People often push back against the notion of promoting capacities for all members of society. We live in a society which champions individualism and perseverance to achieve the American dream. When we fall short, this is often attributed to personal failures. We often lack the sympathy to empathize with others facing hardship when we look at our own lives and the obstacles we surmounted to achieve our success. Why should someone else get a handout when we got here all on our own? This notion that giving special or particular rights to others threatens the security of our own hard-won rights is hard to overcome. But this is where we can turn to the Rawlsian theory of the veil of ignorance to help us overcome these barriers.
Imagine if you were not you. Rawls intuitively understood that a lot of the reason why societies don't become fairer is that those who benefit from current injustice are spared the need to think too hard about what it would have been like to be born in different circumstances. So he devised one of the greatest thought experiments in the history of political thought. He called it the veil of ignorance. Rawls asks us to imagine ourselves in a conscious, intelligent state before our own birth, but without any knowledge of what circumstances we're going to be born into, our futures shrouded by a veil of ignorance. Hovering high above the planet, Rawls was fascinated by the Apollo space program, we wouldn't know what sort of parents we'd have, what our neighborhoods would be like, how the schools would perform, what the local hospital could do for us, and how the police and judicial systems might treat us, and so on. The question that Rawls asks us all to contemplate is, if we knew nothing about where we'd end up, what sort of a society would it feel safe to enter?
Now that we have learned about Rawls's ideas about the veil of ignorance, how does it apply to our discussion of Martha Nussbaum and universal human rights? Nussbaum's framework rests on the assumption that a number of capacities, for instance bodily integrity, senses and imagination and thought, and play, are required for a life of human dignity. How do we know that this is true? Well, if we were all to exist behind Rawls' veil of ignorance, we contend that any individual who did not know his or her station in life would agree that these list of capacities are necessary to live a full, engaged, dignified life. For instance, individuals behind the veil, if they did not know what gender they would be or their economic situation, would want the capacity to participate in political life, as Nussbaum defines as being able to participate effectively in political choices that governs one's life, having the right of political participation, protections of free speech and association. One of the more controversial capacities for Nussbaum is play, which she defines as being able to laugh, to play, to enjoy recreational activities. Behind the veil of ignorance, individuals would want to make sure that they would have the ability to relax, laugh, take part in the social vein of society, not just the political or economic vein. If we all adopted this framework, we would adopt policies to promote this capacity, like for instance making sure all members of our society have access to public parks and leisure activities. Rawls' veil of ignorance supplies an important tool in testing this list of capacities and grounding human dignity and ultimately universal human rights.
Now, all of this might seem overwhelming. There are so many ways to ground this thing called human dignity, and no one seems to be able to agree. Further, there are so many conflicting views out there about how to tackle human rights issues. It is tempting to feel paralyzed in the face of such disagreement, but think about it like this. Most likely, if you went around most rooms and asked people to raise their hands if they agree that all human beings deserve something we can roughly call rights, you would probably get overwhelming agreement. This is what we call the middle principle. At the metaphysical, abstract, top level, there is lots of disagreement about what particularly grounds this principle. Is it God? Is it rational agency? Is it our capacities? Is it what we would choose if we were behind the veil? Is it the result of conversations? Below the middle principle and the application of these rights, there is obviously tons of disagreement about what rights to protect, how to go about protecting these, and perhaps if even some deserve some promotion and what that would look like. But that's okay. We can all turn back to this middle principle and have a good bit of agreement here. Once we begin to bring more and more people to the table about the discussion of the middle principle, we can start to get a group's consensus about what to do and how to change people's lives for the better.
So we are here. Human beings have dignity, and these are tied to a number of capabilities we each possess in some form and at some level. If we take this to be the case, it follows that these capabilities should be protected and promoted up to a sufficient level to live a dignified life. This framework is a call to action for the real world when thinking about human rights. Let's turn back to Tina one more time. Under Nussbaum's framework, Tina's treatment under Scotland's new laws is wrong because it deprives her of the capabilities necessary to live a dignified life. It would not matter in what country Tina lived in. If she lived in a country half a world away, cultural norms wouldn't shield this deprivation of her capabilities. She would in no current society have a sufficient level of the capabilities necessary to live a dignified life. If this framework was universally adopted, we would improve the lives of countless individuals as well as engage in more conversations across cultures. For us and for Nussbaum, the more we engage in these conversations, the stronger this framework will be.